Masrour, who's giving a talk entitled The Geometry of the Visual Field and its Philosophical.
Let me start by thanking Declan, Gary, and Alex for putting up this fantastic conference, and I'm honored to be invited. I'm also particularly excited because Mark and Jan, whose work many years ago I spent a lot of time trying to understand and read, and I had never met, are here, and so that was particularly exciting for me to finally meet two people who have influenced me very significantly, or at least the way I think about issues like this. So I want to talk about some of the dimensions in which the study of the geometry of the visual field is philosophically interesting or has significance. And so I'm going to refer to the empirical findings, the body of findings that have been produced in this line of research, that the geometry of visual fields, or GVF. And I'm going to take these findings at face value. But if taking at face value, I mean that I'm going to interpret them as telling us about how a spatial experience represents the intrinsic spatial features of objects. And the term intrinsic here is a little bit vague. I'm using it in a sense that even colors relations about objects. And I'm going to also assume that these results should be interpreted as telling us something about visual experience as opposed to something, for example, metacognitive. I know there are a lot of issues that have partly come up during these 2 days we have talking about these interpretations. But my goal today is not to to engage in some sort of speculative study. Were it the case that these results should be interpreted at face value, what else might philosophically follow? One more thing to add here is that I have tried in this talk to bridge the philosophy and psychology. Usually when you have to do that, if you're like me and you might basically do it by being hand-wavy on the philosophy part and also hand-wavy on the psychology part. And if it goes well, both sides will be happy. If it goes terribly, both sides will be unhappy. And actually, in this room, I think there is a double reason for both sides being unhappy, because the psychologists in the room are philosophically savvy, and the philosophers are psychologically savvy. So I might completely make you all unhappy. I hope that doesn't happen. Okay, so the geometry of visual field body of data. I mean, this is a very summary. There are a lot of summarized. There are a lot of experiments or studies and important moments in the history of this that are not reflected in this slide. But I mean the study that started with people like Kant and Reid, who were doing like a priori analysis of the structure of the perceptual space, and then gradually became an empirical study and had these moments starting from Helmholtz trying to do experiments on it. And you can say roughly, I'm not quite sure that there is consensus among all the people who were working on this on the empirical side, that it went through these moments that like people started with as a result of the reaction to Blumenfeld's experiments, thinking that maybe the structure of the visual field is hyperbolic, and then you got into this phase where there were a bunch of the views. Some people thought that it has varied curvature. Some people said that there are multiple spaces, and then this view that there is no consistent geometry for the visual field emerged, that I think is nowadays the dominant view, that we don't have a consistent geometry in the visual field. So that's the kind of body of data that I think has important philosophical significance. And I'm going to talk about 3 dimensions of that. The first one I'm going to skip through very quickly. I think this work pushes us toward a form of internalism about the phenomenal character of what grounds the phenomenal character of spatial experience. That's mostly my past work on this topic. So I'm going to just mention it because it comes up at the end of the talk and becomes relevant. Today I'm going to mostly talk about that it pushes against a view that I'm going to call strict pictorialism and a view that I will call singularism. So what do I mean by these internalism, strict pictorialism, and singularism? So you can distinguish. Here's how I'm going to define what I mean by internalism and externalism. You can distinguish between two types of questions about mental representations. One has to do about what is it that a mental representation is representing. What worldly features, relations are being represented by this representation. You can ask the question, how is it that this mental representation is representing this? I don't mean a causal or explanatory story about how we come up with a representation, but something that philosophers sometimes talk about as mode of presentation, or psychologists talk about as format. One aspect in which this talk is going to be high maybe is that I'm going to move back and forth between mode of presentation and format easily in a way that might violate some people's ideas about this, but we can talk about them details later if they become important. So one way to think about the how question is to think about this. For example, if you're at a soccer match and the referee shows you a red card, they are representing that you're out of the game. How are they representing? By using this red card. So that's the question that I'm talking about. There are two questions, the what question and the how question. And what I mean by externalism is kind of an end of a spectrum of views that tries to explain the phenomenal character of a spatial experience is in terms of what is being represented. And the internalist is the end of the spectrum that tries to explain the phenomenal character of a spatial experience in the matter of how these items are represented. So the internalist tries to tell us that when it comes to the phenomenal character of experience, we should think of it as like something like that red card that the referee uses, while the externalist wants to explain things in terms of the worldly properties that are represented. And so I'm just going to use the terms in this way. There are ways that you can be internalist in this sense, but not be an internalist in the sense, for example, that Gibson was worried about. So don't read too much psychological sense of internalism into this view. It's a view about the nature of phenomenal character and what it is grounded in. Okay, so what do I mean by strict pictorialism? This is how I'm going to define the view. It's the view that having visual experiences is a matter of forming representations whose pure content satisfy strict imagistic constraints. And so what do I mean by pure content? When we look at a picture like this, there is a lot that we see in this picture. There are shapes and colors, but there is also, although the picture is two-dimensional, there is three-dimensional depth information. This is the famous Factory Worker's Wife by Ben Shahn. That's a painting. These are workers here. This doesn't have good resolution to it. So there is some sort of depth information. That's a factory behind that door. There is a lot of other information. There is an emotional information. You see poverty. There is a lot that you see. By pure content, I mean the content that is independent from dimension expansion, by which I mean like you reading some sort of three-dimensional content into this, or interpretation, labeling, judgment. There is a sense in which this line and this line and this line are in the image, in the picture on the same plane, but we usually don't interpret them to be. When I talk about pure content, that's the content that I'm talking about. As I said, the strict pictorialist thinks that having visual experience is a matter of forming representation whose pure contents satisfy strict imagistic constraints. So what are strict imagistic constraints? These are constraints that physical images satisfy. Let's keep this here, and I'll come back to this. Let me just add that I don't mean that a strict pictorialist is committed to the two-dimensionality of visual experience. So I will come back to this soon. The third dimension of significance is the view that I call singularism. And that's a view about the nature of what you might call the unity of a spatial experience. Right now, when I'm walking around and having visual experiences, it's not like I'm just having a bunch of visual experiences. It seems that there is a sense in which the environment around me and the properties and features and objects are presented as belonging to the same space. There is a sense in which my visual experiences are unified. Singularism is a view about what is it in virtue of which that my visual experiences are unified. And it's a specific version of a view that you can generally have about relations. So you are a singularist about a relation between certain objects when you hold that the relation between them is grounded in their relation to another object. So for example, the relation of being a sibling of someone is usually we think it's a singularist relation because it's grounded in the relation that the two items that stand in that relation to each other bear to another person, one of their parents, for example. Or the relation of being a colleague of someone is usually understood as a singularist relation. So a singularist about spatial unity is someone who thinks that spatial unity should be understood in terms of the locatedness of visual representation within some sort of single mental frame. That's the view that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so as I said, there are at least these three dimensions of philosophical significance, and most of the talk is going to be about the two bullet points before moving to the main talk. I'm going to just say something quickly about why this study pushes, as I have argued in previous work, towards internalism. And that's the view that we should understand the phenomenal character of a spatial experience in terms of how properties and relations are represented, not what is represented. I think the geometry of visual field research suggests when we combine it with some sort of plausible naturalistic semantics, or what EJ was calling meta-semantics, suggests what I'm going to call multiplicity. Sometimes this is referred to as fineness of grain. There are various philosophical labels for it. And that's the idea that the same spatial property or relation can be correctly experienced in multiple different ways. There isn't one single way for me to experience a spatial property. There are multiple different ways for me to experience it. And this multiplicity is something that pushes us towards internalism. Now, there is a ton to be said about this, but that's what I'm going to just say. This is what I have argued for this in my previous work, because I want to come back to this multiplicity view when, near the end of the talk. Okay, so the goal of the talk is to explain why the geometry of visual field pushes against strict pictorialism and singularism, and then at the end propose an alternative that is neither a strict pictorialist nor singularist. And so first I'm going to talk about pictorialism, strict pictorialism, and singularism, and then I'm going to sketch the alternative. Okay, so what is pictorialism? As I said, it's the view that basically is thinking of visual experiences as constituted in similar ways to imagistic representations. Or to put it the way that I used earlier, it is the kind of representation that it has a pure content and its pure content respects imagistic constraints. So let me push that intuitive way of thinking a little bit more. So think about how we paint. you start with a canvas, you put blotches of color on the canvas. Now, when I like put the red here and the green here, there's a fact of the matter about what their distance is. Or if I put these three circles on the canvas, there's going to be a fact of the matter about whether they're collinear or not. Pictures, painting, posters are usually formed on a frame, canvas, container, something like this. And the format of these representations, when they say these are pictorial imagistic representations, is determined by the structure of this container, the frame, the canvas. And it explains that this structure, the format, explains constitutive constraints over their contents. The view that I'm calling strict pictorialists think that the same kind of applies to visual experiences of the space around us. So they think that they have a strictly imagistic format, the strict pictorialists, in this sense that there is this thing that you can call a frame or frames that have intrinsic structures, like the way that the canvas has an intrinsic structure that determines the format of the visual representations. And that intrinsic structure explains constitutive constraints over what can be represented in visual experience. And this thing, this frame with its format, unlike the case of the physical images or pictures, where we have a physical frame, this is basically a theoretical psychological construct that we create in order to explain basically the constitutive constraints that apply to the contents of visual experiences. So this kind of idea of format of representations comes up in different areas of psychology. I'm sure a lot of you know about this debate back in the good old days about the mental imagery, where the debate was over the format of images, mental images, and the way that that debate was being conducted was basically that the empirical side of the debate was discovering or exploring some constitutive constraints over the content of mental images, and from that arguing that because these constraints apply to the content of mental images and the way the mental images are used in guiding behavior or producing reports, then we should conclude that mental images have this imagistic format. That's the kind of line that people like Koslin and Shapiro were pushing against what they thought was the dominant view, that we should think about mental representation on with the kind of idea of paradigm cases of mental representations have some sort of syntactic linguistic format, and this was supposed to tell us that there is this other way of thinking about mental representation in its format. So basically, the strict pictorialists brings the same sentiment to the case of visual experience. There is this idea of a mental frame or frames that have format. The format is the theoretical construct that explains why there are constitutive constraints over what visual experience can represent. And so, like the way that you might think about the frames that are used in painting and images, this mental frame must have feature-independent structure. It has a structure that shouldn't change. Like the painting, when you paint, the structure of the frame doesn't change when you put color or paint on it. Another feature of this structure of the frame that you use in paintings or pictures is that the structure, you can say that the content is vertical. And this is what I was showing by the placing the blotches of color or the circles on the thing. But when you put things in a specific areas or in specific locations, the location of those items, the features that you place in your space, plus the structure of the space, determine all other spatial relations. So if I have a frame that has a specific structure, and the structure is rich enough, for example, to determine relations of collinearity, when I put items in that structure, that determines whether those items are collinear with each other or not. Or if there are planes in the space that I'm talking about, in the frame that I'm talking about, when I put certain objects in that space, the locations of those objects plus the structure of the space determine whether those objects are on the same plane or not. Okay? So the strict imagistic constraints that the strict pictorialist thinks that visual experience satisfy, one is that it has to have feature-independent structure, its content is determined vertically, and these are not enough to make this a space that you can call imagistic or pictorial. You need to have enough structure. You need to have a satisfaction of certain fundamental constraints that make it the case that you can attribute spatial features to that space. So you need to have this space should have enough structure for you to be able to say that there are lines in it, there are planes in it, there are shapes in it. And that's what is making this pictorial, this frame that you have. Now, the strict imagistic constraints on the on this view about visual experience do not tell us how many dimensions it should have. Basically, the two most fundamental constraints that I'm going to talk about and apply our commitments of this view about visual space is that the content is determined vertically, and it should be respect the type fundamental constraints that you want in order to get the spatial features and relations like lines, shapes, and these kind of things in this space. Okay, now, why think that the geometry of visual field studies suggests that this strict pictorialism is problematic? There is a lot of data in this research that is going in that direction. I'm going to just give you two samples. One is the one that Jan talked about, the violation of Posche axioms, the Posche axiom, and something that has come up in Mark's work that is about violations of metricity, and there is implications about violations of what I call the verticality requirement. So here's again, this came up in Jan's talk. This is Posche axioms. It's telling you basically, suppose you have 4 points in a space, A, B, C, and D, and it is the case that when you connect them, B to D and A to C they intersect. We're talking about the space, we're ignoring the possibility of parallel lines. Then it should be that when you connect them pairwise in the other way, they should intersect too. So this is a condition that the space needs to be satisfied in order for it to have a well-defined notion of a plane. And this is my very, very simplified explanation of how Jan's experiment shows that visual space violates this. This was the case. You had 3 objects, A, B, and C. You're given 3 objects that are fixed in a space, and the subjects are presented with the task of first placing an object D on a line that is collinear with AC, and then another object E that is collinear with BC. This is the first part of the task. And then they are asked to move an object to a point that is collinear with BD, and then another object to a point that is collinear with AE. And it turns out that subjects do not put these objects on the same points. So basically, you get a violation of the Posche axiom that was interpreted as, okay, so this shows that we do not have, as Jan said in his talk also, we do not have planes in visual space. Here is just, again, a very simplified summary of Mark's arguments. Mark has a lot of studies of this. Some of them are based on the the idea of that we can use these psychophysical functions like Stevens' law to predict the relationship between the value of some sort of physical stimulus and its the value of its perceived size. So this is a textbook psychophysics law. Stevens' law basically says that the relationship between the value of a physical property and its perceived value can be described as an exponential function like this with this form. And this is something that Mark tells us that there are. So first of all, the kind of and it should be obvious that the curvature of this this function depends on the value, the exact value of the exponent of the power functions in the Stevens law. And if you have the power function is smaller than 1, you get a concave curve, and if it's bigger than 1, you get a convex curve. And so Mark uses this to show that you get this violations of what you might call concavity and convexity in the visual space, and basically the violation of is it right to say concavity, or should I say concavity? Concavity. So the convexity requirement is basically, you can say that the representation is convex when it satisfies this constraint. If the perceived value of the sum of two items is smaller than the perceived value of one item plus the perceived value of the other item, you say that this is a concave representational function. If the perceived value of the sum of two items is larger than the perceived value of one item plus the perceived value of the other item, you say that this is a convex function. And whether you're going to get a concave function or a convex function for a specific type of representation depends on the value of the exponent of the power function. And as Mark's meta-studies shows, the exponent of power function for most of the properties, spatial properties that we perceive, is often not equal to 1. So you will get either a concave function or a convex function. So if the exponent of the power function for length perception, for example, is not equal to 1, then the perceived length of a line must be either larger or smaller than the perceived length of its parts. And you can argue that this violates the verticality of length. Basically, your perception of length is not determined by location plus structure. So if you, I think this is just a sample of the results that have been produced in GVF. And if you take this seriously, plus the other results, you should start being suspicious about the strict pictorialism. Now, one thing that you might be thinking about, and I haven't talked about, is who is a strict pictorialist anyway? Nobody is a strict pictorialist anyway these days. And I think that's perfectly right. But I think if you are suspicious about the strict pictorialist, you should be also suspicious about map-like perceptual representations in perceptual psychology, and also that are used a lot actually in philosophy talk. I would be happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but let me just briefly, just very quickly say what I mean, and we can expand more on it in the Q&A. Basically, there are a lot of people who, in perceptual psychology who talk about map-like representations. What they mean by a map-like representation is basically very similar to what the strict pictorialist means, but with this additional thing. Maps are basically strict pictures plus some sort of labeling information that can be either explicit or implicit. The explicit or implicit labels tell you which parts or features in your map-like representations you should really interpret or take literally at face value, and which parts you shouldn't. So you can have a map that has either an explicit or implicit label that tells you, look, take the adjacency relations or like size relations in my map seriously. They are really representing size relations. But forget about, for example, whether the two ends of my map, for example, do not connect with each other or not. So a two-dimensional map of the world doesn't tell you that the Japan part and the US part are not related to each other spatially, but that is what we implicitly read into the map. Don't take that part seriously. Or maybe don't take some size relations seriously, but take the topological structure seriously. So basically what is usually meant by map-like representations are something like strict pictures plus some sort of label that gives you an interpretation guide of what to take seriously and what not to take seriously. But whichever part you're taking seriously, you're in a strict pictorialist about, if you believe in map-like representations. And if strict pictorialism should be rejected for fundamental reasons like this, the whole business of map-like representations becomes suspicious. Okay, so now I want to talk about singularism. So as I said, you're a singularist about a relation when you think it should be explained. The relation between two items should be explained in terms of relation to a other item. And the singularist explains the spatial unity in terms of the locatedness of visual representation within a mental frame. Again, this mental frame is supposed to be a theoretical construct. So why is it that my visual experiences are now unified in seemingly one visual field? The singularist says, because there is this mental frame, and it's a single frame that I place things in, and that is the ground for the unity of my visual space or visual experience, if you like. So if you're a singularist, under the threats that the geometry of visual field presents, you would be moved into impoverished, reducing the structure of your single frame. So if you believe that there is a single mental frame whose singularity accounts for the unity of the spatial field, and you see the anti-pictorialist results that the geometry of visual fields get, you see this idea that there isn't really a consistent geometry, then what do you do as a reaction? One way to go is to say, well, there isn't a single frame. There are many, many spaces or many frames. But then you can't be a singularist anymore, because if there are many spaces, then the singularity of one of these spaces cannot account for or accommodate the unity of the spatial experience. So what do? You are forced to avoid inconsistency to assume that our frame does not have a rich enough structure, for example, for a location to determine features such as length or relations such as coplanarity. So if you want to preserve singularism, the GVF pushes you to reduce the structure of this frame, to hold that this frame does not have a lot of structure. For example, it has merely topological structure, or maybe projective structure or affine structure. So the impoverished frame view is what you're pushed towards if you're a singularist. So you should say that visual space is based on a single frame with no structure, maybe, other than singularity, or maybe structure that is very minimal, for example, topological structure. Now, what's wrong with this? Is there a problem with this? I think the problem with this view is that it cannot accommodate at least two other intuitive features of visual experience that I'm going to call substantiality and reticulation. So what do I mean by substantiality? Let's just define substantial and non-substantial. The contrast class of substantial or spatial relations is just bare relations, and it has one member. Let's define them extensionally. The bare spatial relation is just the relation of being in the same space as something else. Substantial relations are relations like is next to, is to the right of, is bigger than, has the same shape as, is collinear with, is coplanar with. Those are, let's call those substantial relations. Okay, so spatial unity is a Bayer relation, and these are examples of substantial relations. Now, here is substantiality. Substantiality thesis is that it is impossible to represent two objects as spatially unified without representing them also as standing in some substantial spatial relation. This is basically, here is the intuition behind this thesis. It is telling you, it is not just that your visual space is a single space. The singularity is itself a substantial spatial feature or relation. If you have two subparts of this space that are unified, there must be some spatial relations between them. It cannot be just the bare unity relation. The content of the spatial unity relations commits you to substantial spatial relation, right? Think about it. Here is another intuitive way to think about it. Suppose I say here are two spaces that are unified with each other, right? You might ask yourself, so what's the relationship between them? Is this one to the right of that one? Do I experience it? Is it above it? How far are they experienced? If they are unified with each other, but there is no answer to these questions, then you might think there is something wrong with the claim that these spaces are unified with each other. That's what substantiality is expressing. And I think this is, I'm not going to talk about it, was an interesting implication of this is that if you are basically use spatial frames to talk about spatial relations, then you cannot say that, oh, I can get unity of various spatial frames by just integrating them with each other. Because unity of a spatial frames itself is a substantial spatial relations. So that if you have multiple spatial frames, the only way that it can be unified if you have pictorialist leanings is that they are included in some sort of meta frame that is itself a spatial. It can't be just accounted for in terms of integration. So I said there are two features that this impoverished view, structure view, cannot accommodate. The first one was substantiality. The other one is what I'm going to call reticulation. Note that although I think we have to reject the strict pictorialism that says, you know, give me locations and a structure and I'll tell you what the other features are, still there is this intuitive feature of visual space that the way you experience, for example, the shape of something constrains the way you can experience the locations of its parts. Or the way you experience the location of something constrains its shape. The way you experience the location of something constrains the way you experience its length and vice versa. There are all these constraints. So that's what I mean by reticulation. The visual space is still it's like a mesh of things that are interrelated to each other. It's not that they have no bearing or relation. They are constraints to each other. This is what I call reticulation. So it is constitutively impossible to represent an object as having substantial spatial property or relation without constraining some other substantial spatial property or relation that one is representing the object as. That's what I call reticulation. If you completely give up reticulation, then I think you're violating something that seems very, very intuitive about the spatial experience. Now, here is the problem for impoverished frame views. If you have a single frame view with minimal structure or no structure other than singularity, you cannot accommodate reticulation and substantiality. If you increase structure, you clash with evidence against a strict pictorialism. If you decrease the structure, you lose the ability to account for reticulation and substantiality. Now, in this claim that I'm making, there's a lot of detail that has to go in here because there are some options we might think intuitively of reducing the structure that might give us reticulation and substantiality. That's a project that someone can pursue, but I think there's a better option. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the last part of the talk. So the dilemma, this is a dilemma for the singulars. They have to tell us what the structure of the single frame is. If they increase it, they clash with the GVF findings. If they decrease it, they violate these intuitive constraints on what visual experience is. So I think rather than trying to save this option, we should first look elsewhere. And that's the part of the talk that is about the alternative. Okay, so here's one thing that some of you might have already noticed. The view that I call the strict pictorialists, their conception of visual space is very similar to the way that Newton thought about physical space. So Newton thought about the physical space as something like a container that had an object-independent structure. So Newton really accepted what I call verticality. You place objects in this container with three-dimensional Euclidean structure, and you have already fixed all the other relations and spatial properties that these objects have. They borrow it from their location plus the structure of a space. So, for example, and Newton accounted for the relation of co-spatiality between objects in terms of the singularity in this of the physical space. So Newton was also a singularist about physical space. So Newton was basically something very close to a strict pictorialist and also a singularist about physical space. Now, why am I talking about Newton? Because, as you know, there was this old debate between Newton and Leibniz about, or Leibniz and Newton's disciples about how we should think about space, about physical space. Leibniz disagrees with Newton. Leibniz doesn't think that there's this thing, a container with a pre-given structure that is object-dependent that we place things in. He thinks that the structure of physical space is something that is less fundamental than relations among objects that are in space, or we describe as quote-unquote in this case. So these relations are more fundamental. What we call the structure of a space is something that is derivative from this. Now, there is a lot that is going on in the disagreement between the Leibnizian conception of a space and a Newtonian, and this is not all there is. For example, they also disagree on how much structure you have. For Newton, you have absolute structure. For Leibniz, you do not have absolute structure. It's a multidimensional debate, but I'm interested in just this component of it. So I think we actually, in order to think about what visual space is, we should try to follow Leibniz, not Newton. And that's where someone who is a strict pictorialist and someone who is a singularist is going wrong. So I think we should adopt a view that in very, very hand-wavy ways can be described like this. We experience the spatial properties and relations of objects in virtue of putting them within a structure of relations to other objects. And I'm going to call this a spatial relationalism. So, can we construct a psychologically respectable form of a spatial relationalism? This is the part of the talk that is kind of more programmatic than, this is still work in progress. I think we can. You can try to give a version of spatial relationalism by following what Leibniz was doing, regarding it as an armchair project that looks as like mathematical features and tries to do that. But I think we should do it on the basis of what a psychological science is. So how do we do that? Here is one observation. What perceptual psychology gives us are usually laws or generalizations that are law-like constraints over contentful states. We can distinguish between two types of such constraints. Some of these constraints are what I call transitional constraints. They tell you what are the laws that govern transitions among contentful states. So, and the other type of law is a constitutive constraint, of the sort that I've been talking about, for example, when you talk about format you want to see. These are the laws that grant facts about how we represent a property, not how we arrive at representing it. So, for example, think about, like here's depth from motion parallax. We have a psychological law that has this very, very generic form. It says that your experience of the depth of an object is a function of observers' representation of their own speed and direction of movement and the apparent motion of the target object relative to a background. So basically, this is a very generic form of the law that you get, psychological law that you get from depth from motion parallax. Okay, so now this kind of law is typically, by psychologists, is interpreted as a transitional law. That is telling you if you have representations M of O and D of O and A of K, this function, this law is describing how you move from this representation to form this representation. So basically, like for example, if you're a computationalist about this, you think that F is describing a computational function that describes how you move from these representations to another representations. But you can think of depth from motion parallax and psychological law as a constitutive law. You can give a constitutive interpretation of this. And this is, I think, basically one of the insights that Gibson has. So you can think about the depth based on motion parallax as an invariance pattern that emerges from the way that we connect, or the function f describes the way that these other representations, although Gibson wouldn't use the term representation, are related to each other. That would be a constitutive interpretation. So there is an invariance pattern in the way that these representations are related to each other. And what it is to experience the depth of an object is to have some sort of implicit grasp, or I don't know what the right term here would be, experience of this pattern of invariance. That would be a constitutive interpretation. So this is not all you can do, because the constitutive interpretation that you give in terms of invariances tells you what it is to experience depth, for example, on the basis of motion parallax. It doesn't give you the value of depth that you're representing an object as having. So you need to do another step towards what this Leibnizian style relationalism to finish the job. Actually, I shouldn't say finish the job, because there are all other intuitive constraints that you should impose on this kind of program. So you can say here's a recipe for a spatial representation. You start with a psychological law. You choose the ones that can be constitutively interpreted. Some of them cannot be constitutively interpreted. Some will say there's no way not to look at them as transitional laws. Just 1 minute. And then that the ones that you can constitutively interpret usually take a invariance form, but you should also, in order to solve the problem of what is it, how much is it that, for example, I'm representing the depth of an object or experiencing the depth of an object, you have to do another step. I'm going to skip on this. This is my, again, very generic characterization of what that step involves. Basically, the result is going to be that you give a relationalist conception of what it is to experience depth with this or that determinate value in terms of the relations, experiencing relations between an object and other objects, or itself. So this is how you might be able to construct what I call psychological spatial relationalism, where the structures corresponding to spatial features and relations are extracted from psychological laws. Now, let me just end with this. Throughout the talk, I was imposing gradually 4 constraints over what an interesting account of the visual field should respect. One of them was the one that I started with. It has to respect multiplicity. We want an account that explains why is it that we can have multiply different correct ways to experience a spatial feature. It should accommodate reticulation, that there are constraints between our representations of spatial features and relations. It should accommodate unity, the intuitive sense in which our experience of the space around us is unified, and it should accommodate substantiality. Now, here is a very, again, fast-hand way to say why this account that I just provided delivers all of these 4 desiderata. So if you have multiple psychological laws that explain how we experience a spatial feature, for example, we have, how many psychological laws do we have that explain depth perception? I don't know, 15, 20, something like that. And of these, more than one can be interpreted constitutively, you will get actually exactly multiplicity, because it is telling you there are multiple different ways to experience a spatial property, because experience is generated from the relations between various objects that your psychological law is telling you. So there is one way of experiencing depth that motion parallax gives us, another way of experience depth that, for example, texture gradient gives us, and many, many other ways of experiencing depth. So that's why there are multiple correct ways to experience depth, and their phenomenology are different from each other. It gives you reticulation because the constitutive connections between experiences of various spatial features exactly explain why and how we experience them. So you already get constitutive constraints between our experiences of various spatial relations in the story that you give about how we experience the spatial relations and features. It gives you unity. This is my other work that we can show in great detail how we can define unity of the spatial things in terms of some sort of connectivity or of constitutive relations among objects, and it gives you substantiality, because we experience basically things to be in the visual field already in virtue of experiencing some of their spatial features and properties, and their unity is a constitutive unity, so you get substantiality on this view too. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to take questions? Yeah. Alex.
Very interesting. If you can bring back the final slide. So, let me try to formulate the Newtonian version of this. Is that Leibnizian?
Yeah.
So, in differential geometry, they have this notion of an atlas.
Atlas.
So, let's say you have the globe, which is not planar, it is not flat.
Mm-hmm.
But you can take small parts of the globe, and they're approximately flat. And then you map them on a flat map. And page 1 is about New Zealand. And page 2 is about Australia. And page 3 is about South Africa.
So you have different pages.
And you tile the whole globe with sticky notes.
How do you stick them in another space in which you are sticking them?
That's the tricky part. They overlap. All of them are flat, but the coast of Africa appears, let's say, on 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there are points that are labeled. This is Cape Horn, and this is Cape Horn. So you know how corresponding points across all of these different charts.
Uh-huh.
And so it can be shown, and Jan will be much better at this than I am. I learned this from his book. That you can build the sphere out of a set of flat charts.
So let me. That's a very interesting example. That's basically is because the relation to differential geometry is that we can think of like curves at like flat things. But yeah, you can approximate with linear functions. But let me try to get the idea first. So you have multiple flat maps, and you said there is overlap between them. In the sense, is it that like if I look at just one of these maps, this area of the map is going to tell me I am overlapping with something else, or not?
Cape Town is this point on this map.
So you have a label that says Cape Town,
yes.
And you have another label
On the other map. And that's how these 2 points on 2 separate charts correspond to the same point on the 3-dimensional globe that you're
So this is not a strictly pictorialist one, because you have labels that help.
You can find corresponding points across different charts, and that will help with the unity. And so then if you move to visual space, there are all these saccades, like 3 times, the eye moves 3 times per second. And so I fixate your face, and I get one chart in which your face is in the middle, relatively less distorted, and I also see kind of the back of Bill's head on one side and the side of Jim's body on the other. And then I fixate on Bill's head. Now he is in the middle, and so everything is kind of a pastiche of these different snapshots. And so within a snapshot, maybe there is a well-defined geometry with good properties. And that gives you reticulation and so forth.
Yeah.
Because there's a multiplicity of them, it's not one globally coherent space. And so all the empirical results, that explains all the empirical results.
So there are two things here. One of this very interesting idea is that we can explain how we can get one unified space out of multiple different maps by using objects as kind of bridges.
Yes.
Yeah, this
Landmarks.
is like landmarks.
You have landmarks.
That's very interesting. But the other one is that each of these submaps itself can be interpreted as having some sort of pictorial structure or vertical structure.
Richer geometry.
Yeah. So I have to think about the first idea way more than I can do right now at this moment. So that's a very, very interesting idea. I have to take it seriously. I'll think about it. But the second one, so there are, in the geometry of the visual field research, there are, like for example, the kind of work that Mark has done, what Stephen Laws, that show that there are local violations of some very basic fundamental axioms. So the concavity, convexity, those kind of things. Is this also taking care of those because we are approximating? How is it doing that?
Ask what is local. If you can make eye movements on my account, if you fixate the lower left-hand corner of your computer monitor and then fixate the upper right-hand corner, they are now two slightly different views, and maybe if you do psychophysics, you will find the discrepancy by 5%. And psychologists will make a big deal. Oh, look, it's not vertical, it is under constant by 5%. Well, maybe that is the difference between fixating the upper corner versus the lower corner. So maybe if there are no eye movements at all, some of these local discrepancies will become not statistically significant or whatever.
If there is no eye movement,
But then we have stabilized images, and the visual system doesn't work like this. But maybe the cortical representation inside our head is like every time you get retinal inputs, it constructs something for 500 milliseconds, and then there is a saccade, there is transsaccadic suppression, so the whole thing is reset and you construct a new one.
But then if this is the way, maybe I'm not completely following the suggestion, but if this is the way, we are giving up Newtonianism. Because we're saying, look, this new thing that you construct can have a different structure. So there is no pre-given structure that is independent of where you place features when you perceive. So this goes back to a comment that I make during Jan's talk. You can think about a structure as a descriptive thing. Like I look at my psychological observations and I try to systematize them using some mathematical tools and call that a structure. Under that way of thinking about a structure, the structure of the visual experience can change very easily. It's flexible and malleable. But if you're a Newtonian, you want to have a pre-given item with a fixed structure. And it sounds to me that you're giving up on that. But let's talk more about this.
But
Yeah.
you want to move on, yes.
Let's move on. This is fascinating, but let's give people an opportunity to talk. Chris.
So thanks for a great, one of your many great talks. So it seemed to me kind of a demanding conception of pictorial representation. So, for Fodor, a representation is pictorial, and parts of it represent parts of what is represented. And he uses this to distinguish conceptual representation, linguistic representation from imagistic representation. But you might also just define it in terms of isomorphism. If there's an isomorphism between structural properties of the representation and properties of what's represented, that's sufficient for iconic representation. And I think you were using something that was much more demanding than that.
I agree with you. Yeah, but so I think the view that I gave at the end can also, in some respect, be called a pictorialist view, as long as you kind of set up your constraints that a pictorialist type of representation has to satisfy and show that this view also satisfies some constraints. because it is satisfying, for example, reticulation, it has to satisfy some sort of constraints. And you can call those the type of representations that satisfy those constraints pictorialist representations. What I'm interested in is not really defining or whether, like, trying to decide how to assign labels, whether this is a pictorialist view or not. What I'm interested in is this idea that there is this thing that we call frame, a frame, that is a theoretical construct that has a structure that is supposed to explain the constraints. Now, I think that imposes, if you think that the structure of that frame is pictorial, it imposes certain constraints on how you can think about pictorialism because you're assuming that there is a thing. So, for example, Fodor can say, or Tai can say, like, a pictorial representation is a type of representation whose parts represent some other parts. Then I'm going to say, why is that? Why is it that this is a type of representation whose parts represent parts, I didn't put in the part, and I think if you think about a pictorial representation in terms of the existence of a frame that has a nature that imposes these constraints, that constraint should be built on and be grounded in something much more fundamental, like verticality. It should have a pre-given structure, and that structure has to satisfy some constraint that tells us this is something that I can describe as a picture. So this is a very important issue in some sense, which is like how much relaxed can we be about the notion of a pictorial representation if we are basically a Newtonian about our conception of what a pictorial representation is. If it's a pre-given canvas that is supposed to give us pictures. I think we have to say more about what grounds the constraints that you proposed, in that context.
A project I have and other people have is distinguishing between perception and conceptualization.
Yeah.
And you might want to say that one of the features of perceptual representation is that it's pictorial, and it's sufficient for this purpose to say that pictorial representations involves isomorphism. And that is what would be important to you. And not
for that project. Yeah, for that project, if that is your explanatory project, then maybe it's sufficient for that. But if your explanatory project is that I want to explain all the constitutive constraints that are over the content of visual experience in terms of positing something that has an intrinsic structure, then the explanatory game changes a little bit. And I admit that I have to say much more about this, but I don't think the requirements are exactly the same. If your goal just is to distinguish perceptual representation from conceptual representation, then your goal is to explain why is it that there are certain interesting, intuitively imagistic constraints that apply to, say, visual representations.
So I can't help myself. You're going to have to put more constraints than what counts as a Hahnemann maximum.
Of course.
Otherwise, you're going to end up with, for example, numerals being.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Susanna.
I'm a bit confused about the format, but that might be largely due to the fact that initially you said you think of them as modes of presentation, and I think maybe you just don't think of them as modes of presentation at all, or if you do, I didn't see anything that has anything to do with modes of presentation in the way you talk about formats.
Okay, let's just forget about the mode of presentation talk.
Okay, I'm done. I mean, that's all.
Well, I think like if you're talking about if you're talking about the format of conscious representations in the way that the psychologist talks about, and there is a way to translate that into the way a philosopher who thinks that perceptual representations have imagistic formats thinks about that specific mode of presentation of perceptual experiences that should be distinguished from, for example, a descriptive mode of presentation that like you might associate with concepts. That's the link. I don't think they are the same concepts.
Yeah, I didn't. That wasn't.
That's not helping.
No. But if you just want to drop the mode representation out, then I'm happy.
Peter?
Can you go back to the psychological spatial relational definition? I guess I was just sort of trying to get a handle on what would it be, how would you deny this sort of use? Because I was just thinking, if I experience the location of an object by placing it in a reference frame, there's a sense in which the origin of that frame is another object, and so I'm representing its location by its relation to another object. So would I, in effect, in order to deny this view, have to say that I have some other way of representing the object's location in a primitive way without placing it within a reference frame? I'm just sort of trying to get a handle on what like this.
Yeah, that's good. I am thinking of location not being a relation. Maybe that's creating the confusion. I mean, like, maybe that's why I am creating. Yeah, I am creating a confusion. So I don't see location as basically a type of relation when I'm defining things in this way.
Because it's not even a relation with the frame. So location doesn't have, doesn't the frame define the set of locations within it?
Doesn't a frame define a set of locations within it?
It's a frame. They're just objects and relations between.
Yeah.
I guess so, but this is neutral on egocentric versus allocentric representation, because if it's egocentric, then it's represented in relation to myself and I'm an object. So.
Mm-hmm. So if you, in the most abstract notion of a space, belonging to a space is basically a set membership. And if you say these objects belong to the space, you're basically expressing a set member condition. And if you just express relations between various types of objects, you still don't have location. Whereas on a Newtonian view, you need to have a space that has pre-given locations in it, and the relations are inherited, as it were, from where you put the object in that location. So that, yeah.
Okay, so just think about it as like primitive names for different locations.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I see.
Like local sign.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
So I can follow up on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I do a demo with my students about mental imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes like this: close your eyes, imagine a grid. Maybe that's already a space, but put the number 1 in the middle and 2 above it and 3 to the right and so forth. And then I ask them what is to the left of 7.
Uh-huh.
And they can tell me. So there's this chain of relations. And because of the spatial layout, there is a correct answer in Euclidean geometry about what would be next to 7 if you actually successfully perform this. And people can do this with their eyes closed. And so, if you have relations between objects, and then ask something about yet another relation, and people consistently tell you that, and this whole structure of relations is isomorphic to some subset of some geometry, isn't that just another way of defining a canvas and a space? And geometries are defined. Here are points, here are lines, and there are these 5 axioms about the relationships between points and lines.
Yeah, my claim is that there is no structure here. The claim is, do you build the structure out of these relations,
yes,
or the structure is pre-given?
If you have relations, why do you say there are no locations? Locations.
Well, you can build locations of these relations.
Yes.
But so the debate is over which one is more fundamental than the other one, right? So on Newton's conception, you have this space and it has locations in it independent of whether you have put objects in it or not. The location is fundamental. When I put one object here and another object here, the relationship between them is inherited from the relationships between those locations, right? Now here is another thing. So let's say you give me 10 objects and I write down a very, very rich structure of relations between them. And when I look at these relations, I see that, oh, I can construct a space out of these with locations where I can say this object is located here, this object is located there. The structure can be very rich, the structure can be impoverished. But I did not build, the space wasn't fundamentally there from which I inherited the locations. I did it the exact opposite. I built the space out of the relations. From some points of view, this may not be at all important. So a mathematician doesn't care about, when they're talking about the notion of a structure, whether it's built bottom up or they are just interested in interrelations and constraints between the location, for example, and shape. Which one comes first, they are not interested in. This is kind of, in some sense, a strictly philosophical debate that some people might think, oh, it doesn't even, make any sense, or it's not significant, because on both views you get a structure. The debate is over fundamentality.
Yeah, I just want to have a follow-up question. So I've been listening to you your entire talk. I think one fundamental concept of your spatial relationalism is objects.
Yeah.
What is an object in your definition?
Concrete particulars.
In reality, how did you get an object? When you compare a relationship, when you get a relationship, you first have to define what is an object. For mathematicians, they look at lines and points. They have low dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about real objects in visual space. If you want to relate this back to anything that is in perceptual psychology or anything, you have to define object in this. Some of these things are mathematical discussions. A lot of these concepts. Some of these are related to physical objects.
Yeah.
What is an object?
Well, when we're talking about visual experience, whether we're talking about physical objects or not, depends on whether your philosophical view about whether you have in visual experience you're directly related to objects or they are kind of mental items. That's one issue. But the other issue is that I think what you're interested in is the distinction between what I call an object and, say, lines and points, and where in mathematics we sometimes call them objects, right? That's definitely not what I mean by an object. I mean concrete, particular things that are exemplified by ordinary things, tables and chairs, or maybe atoms and molecules and fundamental particles. And that's what I mean by objects. Do I have to define it?
Yeah, you have to, because from my point of view, within each object, there are also relationships. You look at a chair, the chair consists of many parts. There's relationships within the chair. So you cannot just tell me that you're looking at the relationship between chairs, but you're not talking about the relationship within a chair.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm asking you, when you construct visual space or construct all these philosophical points, I want to make it a bit more concrete. That is, what level are you talking about, right?
So there's one thing that I'm not seeing. You obviously you are seeing some sort of demand on what I'm saying. That you're expressing by tell me what objects are. Otherwise, you're gonna run into problems. And maybe one intuitive way to think about it is that the object itself, if it's more than just a point, then it's gonna have some sort of parts that have to be spatially related.
Right.
So maybe the object cannot be prior to the space because its parts have to be spatially related. What if I build an object? Maybe now I'm getting closer to what your worry is. But if I build an object out of parts that have no dimensions, think about the parts of infinitesimal parts of objects, and that's my the atomic notion of object that we should be working with. And then we build bigger objects out of relations between the atomic. Would you be happy with that, or there is still a problem?
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm getting to, but I'm not sure. That's what I'm asking you. I'm not sure when you refer to objects in your construction, which level you're talking about. Because
I haven't identified the level. I have to think about whether that poses a big difficulty for me or not. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, then I guess there's a version of that, because there's the sort of formal problem, I guess. That was sort of what was. But this is a claim about sort of how psychology works, I guess, in some sense, right?
This is a claim about
How
how.
we experience spatial relations.
Yeah.
Right? And then we begin with some notion of an object, which would have to be some kind of psychological conception of it. And we build up from that our psychological experience of spatial relations, which you characterize in terms of objects.
We start with objects and their relations, and then we build on our space out of that. Yeah.
And then I guess there's a different version of the problem set, which is the psychological question. What's the psychological notion of object? Do you require an explanation of that doesn't advert to spatial relations? In the psychological case, so not a formal problem about geometry, let's say, but in the psychological grasp of objects, that's going to be non-spatial. And then on the basis of that, you get to spatial relations. Is that plausible?
I don't know. It might be that I start with some sort of impoverished version of an object. Let's say this is just a cartoonic version. Let's say I start at an object and a specification of its size relations to other objects, right? Then that tells me that this object, for example, how much space does it have to occupy? And then that commits me to some sort of relations among its parts because that space is bigger than a point. If that is what is going on, then I have to end up specifying when it is the case that an object has a spatial extent that is large. I have to also have relations among its parts to define the shape and all those kind of things. But to start my project, I didn't have to do that. So that's why I keep pausing. I'm wondering whether I really need to satisfy the demand, or that can come off when I increase the relational structure that I'm getting from parts of objects. I'm not sure. Since this is at the level of detail that I have obviously not worked on.
Stop there. Thank you very much.